Chapter 22, The Gilded Age, Part 1. Introduction. This is Part 1 of the lecture on the Gilded Age, a huge story, basically the story of how the country negotiated the transition, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, into the modern age, the industrial age, our age, replete with a lot more whistles and bells today than it had at the beginning, gadgets like computers, the internet, iPads, cell phones, and jet planes, but our age is still just a more modern incarnation of the Gilded Age, the age of the machine, of dependence on machines, of mass production, of predictable prosperity, also produced by machines, and also of the impersonalization and the objectification of life and work. The age of the individual in the lonely crowd. The values of our modern world were put in place in this period, starting way, way back, 150 years ago. This is Part 1 of how that world was created. Of course, it is about much more than the mechanization of life, too. In fact, it is quite an amusing period as well, almost melodramatic now as we look at it through the soft and nostalgic lens of history. It includes plenty of stump-pounding politicians, the usual political corruption, which today seems sophomoric by comparison, lots of flamboyant robber barons, George Armstrong Custer and his famous Last Stand, plenty of financial scams and Wall Street crashes, plenty of ethnic and class conflict, which was a big deal back then, like race relations became later, plenty of Jim Crow down in the South, plenty of union activism and union busting, 5 presidents in this period, and that's just Part 1 of the Gilded Age. 1 assassination, a lot of attempted reform in every way, economic, political, social, financial, religious, and cultural. And the period includes 2 new political parties, both of which actually made a difference, and at least 1 golden-throated orator whose speeches still resound today with the truths he had to say. Yes, the Gilded Age was appropriately named. It had a lot of gilt, G-L-I-T, the service imitation of gold, but people back then didn't have much, if any, guilt, G-U-I-L-T, as in guilty, embarrassed, or ashamed, about any of the excesses of their dramatic time. It was, by our standards, a wild and untamed period, offering opportunity for anybody willing to stick to their goal and work harder than the next guy to get there. And you could cut a corner now and then and get there sooner if you were discreet about it. There's more in the Gilded Age, Part 1, than I have time or space to describe even by way of mentioning what the lecture will teach you, so I'm just going to hit the high points. You will see what I mean when you get into it. To start with, this lecture will teach you what finally happened to Reconstruction in the South. Then you will learn why Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, and how competent a president he was. That will give you some insights into the no-holds-barred, competitive, unregulated business and political environment of the Gilded Age. You will learn a lot about Boss Tweed, for instance, a much-maligned character in your history book, whose story is always only partially told. Now, though, you'll get the whole story of Boss Tweed, and you will see him in the context of his times. Tweed was as much a product of his environment as you are of yours. And that's the point of studying the Gilded Age, as it is of studying history generally, to learn the context, so you can fairly evaluate the people about whom the stories are told, as well as their motivations. You will need that willingness to suspend judgment when you study everybody connected with the Gilded Age, including George Armstrong Custer. After you have listened to this lecture, you will be able to empathize as much with the Sioux and the Cheyenne Indians at Custer's Last Stand as you can with Custer's unfortunate soldiers. Custer is part of the Gilded Age because the Gilded Age included making room for progress and prosperity by any means necessary, including killing all the Indians out west if it came to that. The mindset of destroying your opponent instead of just mastering him in fair competition is what the Gilded Age was all about. That's how and why the Gilded Age gave us not just rich business tycoons, but robber barons, not just corrupt politicians, but political machines, employing hundreds of corrupt politicians, like Boss Tweed's Tammany Hall. The movers and shakers of the Gilded Age didn't do anything by half measures. They didn't have recessions and economic downturns, for instance. They had panics, as they called them, wholesale runs on the banks, when millions of people lost their savings and hundreds of banks went under. Nobody sued the banks after that. Everybody just started over. Gilded Age speculators didn't just flip houses and invest in promising businesses. They invested in transcontinental railroads and steamship companies, which wouldn't make a dime for years, but then would generate wealth beyond the dreams of avarice when they were finally up and running. The trick was always to keep them alive until that day came. Unions had a very hard time getting started in the Gilded Age, as you might imagine, because a businessman had a legal right in those days to his profits. Anybody who picketed his business, or any employee who walked off the job, was arrested for robbing the business owner of his profits, just as surely as if the employee had taken the money out of the till. Like I said, the Gilded Age was a no-holds-barred contest, and those who failed deserved to fail. That was the thinking. That's how folks in the Gilded Age looked at life. At least the carnivores at the top of the food chain. We see it in their politics. You will especially notice it in the national election of 1876, and I'll explain why. We see this attitude in the Gilded Age culture generally, in the institutions of Jim Crow in the South. And in the North, we see the Gilded Age competitive attitude in the ethnic tensions and class warfare that divided the cities and caused riots over perceived slights that we find merely amusing. When Gilded Age politicians, and much of the public generally, thought that a certain ethnic group, like the Chinese, were an unwelcome minority, they didn't just require future Chinese immigrants to be better educated, or come to this country with job skills. They took away the citizenship of Chinese people who had already been here for decades. They closed the door to further Chinese immigration indefinitely, and took away the citizenship of any Chinese person who left the country for any reason, so that person could not come back. Later, they expanded their list of forbidden immigrants to include not just Chinese people, but anybody from Asia. That was the Gilded Age for you. Brutal, clear, and uncompromising. It was, as you might expect, an age rife with bribes, payola, crooked deals, scams and schemes, kickbacks, forgeries, snake oil doctors, fortune-tellers, gamblers, thieves, smooth-talking salesmen, pickpockets, and hypocrisy. Barnum and Bailey started their circus during the Gilded Age. Their motto was, "There's a fool born every minute." Even honest people had a winner-take-all, get-it-while-you-can attitude. When the Populists started their new political party about 1890, they didn't just build it around a few modest demands that the Republicans and Democrats had overlooked. No, they wanted the government to abolish all national banks, the source of many of the financial panics of the time, pass legislation to establish a graduated income tax, make senators directly electable by the people, like congressmen were, reform the corrupt civil service, mandate an 8-hour day for all workers, and control all of the railroad, telegraph, and telephone companies, among many other less important demands. They were, in short, insisting on a whole new relationship of the people with their government. Their aggressive attitude was wholly Gilded Age. No other political party has since then dared to demand such a thorough revamping of the political system. Their ideas were, let's demand everything and maybe the mainstream parties will adopt 10% of it. In fact, the mainstream parties adopted much more than 10%. And therein lies the magic and the meaning of the Gilded Age. By going big all the time, by fair means or foul, big things got done. The heritage of the Gilded Age lives on today in quasi-monopoly business giants like Boeing, Microsoft, and Apple, Sure, they aren't U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. They aren't the trusts that Teddy Roosevelt threatened to bust up at the end of the Gilded Age. But the modern version of the trusts got their tools and their skills by emulating the bare-knuckle business brawlers who became the Gilded Age robber barons. So that's what you need to remember about this lecture on the Gilded Age, Part 1. And as you listen to all the hugely entertaining details about this brawling chapter in our history, as unfettered with rules and regulations as a knife fight in a phone booth, you could write a persuasive term paper on the desirability of returning to that era in the modern age. If we had no rules to limit the aspirations of the most clever and ambitious among us, would society at large benefit more thereby than we benefit today by sharing the same corral of limited opportunity imposed upon all of us by the bureaucratic state?
Chapter 22, The Gilded Age, Part 1.
In this lecture you will discover the trials and tribulations of the Southerners and the freedmen in the South during Reconstruction, which you learned about in the previous lecture, were just one chapter, one story, one plot, not even one act in a larger play which was being played, and played out, elsewhere in the country. We shall visit the South again in the course of telling this larger story, because the Southerners were partially involved in it. The larger story does explain why the rest of the country eventually moved on to other issues, and Reconstruction mostly fell off the national radar. Everybody was eventually willing to just let the Southerners go on about their business in their own way, reconstructed or not. The proudest of the so-called redeemers among the Southern whites then claimed a victory in the culture war with the North, which attained for them, they thought, most of the privacy and independence they had sought politically and failed to achieve militarily in the Civil War. They didn't talk much about the attendant poverty, illiteracy, and backwardness which hung like an albatross around the necks of the Southern people for almost 100 years after the war. But after 1877, Northerners weren't much interested in that anyway, or in the Southerners' story one way or the other. Starting about then, the American myth of the South, the one you see in Gone with the Wind, was born. Southerners and Northerners were equally delighted with the fiction. We still are. More people have seen Gone with the Wind than any other movie in history, and people still go see it when it makes the legacy movie rounds. You should see it too, just so you know how Americans chose to remember the South after the Southerners decided to live in its fantasies rather than in modernity. They did, of course, come around in the end. Today the South is as modern as Manhattan, but that story is many lectures away. In this lecture we will discover that the rest of the country during what Mark Twain dubbed the Gilded Age, roughly the 20 years from 1870 to 1890, was going through changes and conflicts not less arduous in their way than the freedmen and the Southerners were enacting on their smaller stage south of the Mason-Dixon line. Here a note of caution is in order. As you progress further and deeper into the history of your country, sooner or later, which for some of you means about now in the story, you may begin to ask, doesn't the conflict and the quarreling ever stop? Isn't there a fixed set of ideas and ideals somewhere that everybody can agree on? Can't we, as Rodney King famously said, just get along? Well, the short answer is no, we can't, but that's not a weakness in our story. It is, on the contrary, the magic of it. If you want to live in an environment of timeless cultural, political, economic, and social stasis where nothing changes for hundreds of years, you could emigrate to any number of places where tradition and heritage are not just set in the cultural concrete, so to speak, but also where daring to diverge from these universally accepted norms is punished. The reason this place, this country, is so special is exactly because we have permission to color outside the lines, as it were, both individually and collectively. And Americans have worn out a lot of crayons doing just that. At the end of this course, you will also learn that a lot of people don't want you to have the crayons anymore. You will find the Gilded Age a story of incessant conflict, but it is all part of the process of becoming, which is your birthright as an American, as it was that of your ancestors in the Gilded Age. We will first examine the political conflicts of the time, and then the economic conflicts.